Israel is not a democracy, for sure. A democracy would not be throwing more than 6,000 bombs on 2.3 million people entrapped in an open-air prison, in a concentration camp, as I've heard repeatedly over the past few days this term, which I think is quite accurate to describe the situation in Gaza. Democracies don't carry out inhumane acts and acts that amount to apartheid, to genocide, to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if these are the shared values that the European continent would like to share with Israel and with similar regimes, then that needs to be seriously questioned and challenged and interrupted by the people.
What we are seeing right now in Gaza is horrible. When Hamas attacked Israel, the reaction of the Israeli government was horrendous and disproportionate. We mourn the death of every civilian, Palestinian or Israelis who are innocent, but we do not accept the way that Israel is bombing schools, hospitals, children, refugees, journalists, and so on. We think to understand the causes of this situation, we need to go back and understand the roots of what is going on in Palestine right now. This is what our podcast will talk about today. Welcome, Maha Abdallah. Could you maybe start by introducing yourself?
Thank you, Sander. Good morning. My name is Maha Abdallah, and I'm from Jerusalem, and I'm based here in Brussels. And by profession, I'm a legal researcher and a human rights advocate, but at the moment, I'm a teaching assistant in the Faculty of Law at the University of Antwerp, doing my research in the field of genocide studies.
Mm-hmm. And I believe your focus is also on the financial flows that sustain the Israeli settlements, right?
Yes, that's the other part of my research outside of the university, yes.
Okay, I think you are the perfect guest to introduce us a little bit on the topic of Palestine. I think most of us grew up with the idea that there has always been violence between Israeli and Palestinian people. This is what the mainstream narrative is teaching us. Could you maybe start by explaining who are the sides in this situation?
There's a situation of settler colonialism in Palestine. It's not violence that has come out of the blue. For decades, Palestinians have been subjected to oppression, to fragmentation, to dispossession that have formed what is that have led us to where we are today. In 1948 and even before that, as the state of Israel was being developed and incepted and coming into being, it was at the expense of the Palestinian people, at the expense of their dispossession, of their removal from the land, in order to allow room and space for settlers to come and replace the indigenous people. And the settler colonial project has used several tools in order to ensure and exert its domination and to acquire as much territory as possible with as little or as few Palestinians as possible, including through imposed military occupation, including through establishing an apartheid regime in Palestine and against the Palestinian people, and other forms of persecution. So the violence is, again, as I mentioned, does not come out of the blue. It's a result of decades of imposed oppression.
Mm-hmm. So there's the Israeli colonial project, and then there are the Palestinians who are the oppressed people in this case.
Yes, there's the Israeli colonial project, which is premised on the Zionist political ideology and movement, which has sought to establish a land for a people, assuming or presuming that the land is empty. And by declaring the land of Palestine empty, when Palestinians and Arabs were well and alive and thriving socially, culturally, historically, economically, at the moment, since that moment, Zionism, which has brought the state of Israel has declared a genocidal warfare on the Palestinian people by completely denying their existence and presence on the land and moving on with the settler colonial project.
So since the 7th of October, the situation in Palestine has been all over the media, and the Prime Minister of Israel, he declared that a war had been started. Do you believe that we can say that since the 7th of October we're talking about a war? Or do you think this it's wrong to say this because, like you mentioned earlier, we already have this history of colonialism? So what's your view on that?
It is a form of war, definitely, that has been declared on Palestinians generally, but specifically in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. And it's also an unprecedented form of war in the level of its intensity, in the level of how clear and obvious the intent of the Israeli government and the Israeli military have been so far in this current warfare on Gaza specifically. And the intent has been said and has been very well articulated by various Israeli leaders, whether from the government, from the military, but also from the parliamentarians, Israeli parliamentarians, and other political and religious figures. The intent was clear and has been demanded that there is a wholesale, a comprehensive destruction of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip, and this includes the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The intent is to eliminate Gaza and to destroy it as a form of retaliation, as a form of collective punishment, as a form of persecution. And through the different statements that we've been hearing, and also the policies and the actions that have been taken by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military towards Palestinians in Gaza, including by cutting off the electricity, cutting off the power, denying food, medical aid, and water from accessing the Gaza Strip, but also fuel. These all amount to genocide and incitement to genocide, but also potentially the commission of the crime of genocide. And this signals like a very serious warning at the moment. In 2023, we're witnessing various forms of violence and aggression against Palestinians that may amount to genocide.
It's interesting that you mentioned like how this is not just against the people in Gaza, but the Palestinian people as a whole. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because, for instance, I also heard the news that people in the West Bank, which for the people who don't know, the Gaza Strip is an open-air prison often called, or maybe even a concentration camp. People are stuck on a very small surface with more than 2 million people. But then there's East Jerusalem and the West Bank, who are officially not in a situation where they are completely locked off. And also in these zones, we see that Israel is now also killing Palestinians. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, there has been an imposed fragmentation on the Palestinian people, just to go back a little bit to the first point you raised. And ever since the establishment of the State of Israel, it was very deliberate in fragmenting Palestinians across different geographic locations, but also giving them different legal statuses. And the idea was to deny Palestinians the ability to be collectively together, the Palestinian people, and instead of being in one contiguous territory, we're now all over the place. Some of us are in the West Bank, some of us are in the Gaza Strip, some of us are in Jerusalem, some of us are in imposed exile and in diaspora, the Palestine refugees, and some of us are those who were able to remain after 1948, remain in across the various towns, cities, and villages within 48, within what is now Israel. So this imposed fragmentation is part and parcel of the overall colonial project, of the overall overall domination and oppression of the Palestinian people. It's an integral part of the apartheid regime as well that Israel has established against the Palestinian people. And as you said, in the aggression, or as we're seeing, like the genocidal warfare that has been triggered against the Palestinians, particularly since the 7th of October, is not limited to Palestinians in Gaza. It has also entailed Palestinians in Jerusalem, across other parts of the West Bank, and within 48. And for example, since the 7th or 8th of October, we've seen at least 90 Palestinians who were killed across the West Bank, including in Jerusalem, by Israeli military and Israeli settlers. Settlers have been continue to carry out attacks against Palestinian homes, villages, businesses across different parts of the West Bank. Again, this is not new. Israeli settler violence in particular has escalated over the past few years, but now we're seeing another resurgence, and we're seeing the Israeli government, even emboldening the settlers more by giving them weapons, by kind of calling on them to take matters into their own hand, let's say, and to attack Palestinians. And this, of course, is very dangerous. Also, in other parts of Palestine, we see a deliberate and mass-scale campaign of arrests and detention of Palestinians. In just 2 weeks, the number of Palestinian prisoners doubled from 5,000 plus to 10,000 plus. And this is largely because Israel has been rounding up Palestinians from left to right and putting them in jail. So many cases that we're reading about and hearing about is simply because of posting and sharing news on social media about what's going on in Gaza. A lot of intellectuals, a lot of activists have been detained. A lot of Palestinians from Gaza who work in Israel or in settlements in the West Bank have been detained. We're talking about thousands of Palestinian laborers who have been detained by the Israeli military. So we're seeing those kind of attacks and targeting. And of course, the dispossession, the eviction, the expulsion, the displacement from homes across the West Bank continue, demolitions continue, and the usual structural violence that Palestinians are subjected to, whether through barriers, physical barriers, the wall, the checkpoints, and other restrictions on freedom of movement continue across the West Bank and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Here in the West, Israel is being portrayed as a full-fledged democracy, a democracy with European standards, with Western standards. That's how they portray Israel. But then you have organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, who are calling Israel an apartheid state. Who's right, according to you?
I think the actions, the policies, the rhetoric are what determine who's right. It's Israel is no longer or has never actually hid what its intentions are, how it will carry out its project, and how it will get to the elimination and entire removal of the Palestinian people. And I think that's quite telling of who's right and who's not. There are facts on the ground that speak to themselves, and there are facts throughout history that show us who's been the perpetrator, who's been the aggressor, who's the colonizer, who's carrying out all these acts of oppression and persecution against Palestinians, but also against other parts or categories of the society. Israel is not a democracy, for sure. A democracy would not be throwing more than 6,000 bombs on 2.3 million people entrapped in an open-air prison in a concentration camp, as I've heard repeatedly over the past few days this term, which I think is quite accurate to describe the situation in Gaza. Democracies don't carry out inhumane acts and acts that amount to apartheid, to genocide, to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if these are the shared values that the European continent would like to share with Israel and with similar regimes, then that needs to be seriously questioned and challenged and interrupted by the people.
Mm-hmm. So you think the comparison apartheid, like from the South African racial segregation system, it's justified. Could you maybe explain what does it mean Israel is an apartheid state?
I don't usually like to compare situations to each other. Sure, for the purposes of understanding the situation, it's important. But I think at each and every situation and each and every struggle is different, has its own specifics, and so on. But apartheid, in the legal and factual sense, in relation to Palestine, we see it through different ways. We see it again, as I mentioned, in the fragmentation of the Palestinian people. This is very deliberate in order to exert domination in the various laws, policies, and military orders that have been enshrined over decades. For decades, we're talking about more than 7 decades now of passing these laws and military orders and policies that have put Palestinians in an inferior category in order to allow for the Israeli settler population to take over the land, to exploit the resources, land, water, and other natural resources, and establish and lead a life as a superior category or a superior group. And this is this is what I mean by establishing apartheid. And we see apartheid in for example, in unlawful exploitation of Palestinian water resources and diverting them for the purposes of the Israeli economy, of the Israeli population, whether the settler population in the occupied Palestinian territory or the Israeli population within Israel proper. So the average Israeli citizen has access to water unconditionally, non-stop, whereas most Palestinians in the entirety of Palestine would have limited access to water resources in their homes. They would be prevented from connecting to water networks in certain areas and in certain communities. They would be deprived the ability or denied the ability to renew any of the or renovate any water wells and water structures. Water apartheid in reality means looking or passing through a settlement on a hot summer's day and saying that it's very green, very lush. There are swimming pools that are functioning. Meanwhile, the city or the village, the Palestinian village right next to it, or if I go at home and I wouldn't find water to shower or to do laundry or. So this is the kind of water apartheid that we see, for example. One example of what apartheid looks like. Apartheid looks like in the segregation of roads across the West Bank, roads that are only allowed for Israeli settlers and Palestinians are not allowed on them. It also means the inaccessibility to land. You could be a Palestinian landowner and it has been confiscated and appropriated and granted access to Israeli settlers, whereas you as the rightful owner could not access your land and develop it. So we see apartheid in very different forms. Of course, maybe like one of the most striking forms of apartheid as well is the different legal status that Palestinians in the West Bank enjoy versus Israeli settlers enjoy. Palestinians in the West Bank, they are persecuted prosecuted under Israeli military law, whereas Israeli settlers living in the West Bank as well, they are, it's Israeli civilian law that applies to them. So you're treating two people within the same geographic area considerably differently for the purpose of establishing this superiority between two social groups or ethnic groups or groups.
Mm-hmm. Israel calls organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, but many others who call out Israel for their apartheid system, their response is that it's an anti-Semitic analysis. Maybe it's important to think about this for a moment. Is calling Israel an apartheid state, is it anti-Semitic?
Of course not. Criticizing the state of Israel and Zionism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's a legitimate criticism of politics, of a political movement, of a political institution, of a state, and that should not be conflated with anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, as you said, Israel has been carrying out like a very well coordinated campaign for decades now to criminalize civil society, to criminalize solidarity groups, to criminalize any movement or any activity in support of Palestinian rights. And this is not new or unprecedented. And this is part and parcel of Israel's deliberate and targeted or targeting of Palestinian resistance. This is one form of it, and unfortunately, many of the Western states have also followed suit in criminalizing any form of activity or activism for Palestine, and we see this also in the criminalization of different human rights organizations with under Israeli law and under Israeli military orders. Just 2 years ago, we've seen Israel declare 6 of the most prominent Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist, as unlawful organizations. These are the very same prominent human rights organizations that work to monitor and document violations on the ground. Some of them provide humanitarian assistance, some of them seek accountability at international level, for example, at the International Criminal Court, but also in other UN mechanisms. And we've seen Israel repress and suppress all forms of resistance, regardless of the time frame, from the 80s, from the 70s, and then again now in recent years. So the framing or the false framing of anti-Semitism, of it being anti-Semitic or criminal, I think these are all just tactics to try and undermine as much as possible any form of support or movement for the struggle.
Because it's against Zionism, right? Which is a huge difference between Zionism and like the interest of the whole Jewish people, for example. It's a big difference.
Of course. The Palestine struggle has nothing to do with the Jewish religion or the Jewish people. This is not it. And I thought that this was the ABCs that everybody has already taken for granted. We're not talking about a religious conflict or whatnot. This is propaganda. This is nonsense. We should definitely not buy into this. And again, it's been 75 years, and I would really hope that the people around the world do not still perceive it as a religious conflict, because it's certainly not. We're talking about an imperial settler colonial project in Palestine that does not distinguish between religions and does not distinguish between affiliation. As long as you're a Palestinian, you're inferior, you're targeted, you're going to be exterminated, eliminated, whether physically or otherwise. The collective and individual Palestinian identity and collectivity is what's being targeted, not you as a Palestinian Muslim, or you as a Palestinian Christian, or you as a Palestinian Jew, or you as a Palestinian atheist or whatnot. As a shared Palestinian identity and collectivity, this is what's at stake.
Thank you very much for the explication so far. So I think if people know really what you have been telling right now, the next question that comes into mind is, why does the West and the Western leaders make tweets, I stand with Israel, but for example not, I stand with Gaza? Because I think right after the attack of Hamas, the Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, she pronounced her support for Israel. Our prime minister in Belgium did it. The Israeli flag was being screened on the building of the European Commission. I recently learned also that Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is crafting a bill to send $2 billion extra military aid to Israel. Why does the West support Israel that much?
I think the why is important, but I think the more important question today is how we could challenge it, to be honest. The why, I think, has many different reasons. Israel is, again, it's a project that was conceived and perceived here from this continent. So it's not very surprising to see that the West continues to unconditionally support Israel in its endeavor to carry out and finalize its project in Palestine. This is by no means surprising. There's, of course, a lot of geopolitical, economic interests that also come at stake at the moment. And I think we should all be conscious and aware of the changing dynamics in the region, whether in Europe or in Palestine and the region and all over. And we should remember all the various agreements and recent agreements that have been signed between Europe and Israel, but also between Europe and the Arab states, between the Arab states and Israel. And maybe that could give us a bit of direction on why at the moment we're seeing a mass-scale war against Palestinians in Gaza specifically, and why we're seeing so much explicit support for this war. I'm not an expert in these issues, but I would advise the listener, the reader, to, investigate that, because I'm sure there are a lot of actors that are currently profiting from what's going on, and that will profit as well in the near future from the results of this ongoing war.
Can you maybe highlight like the role of the European Union in it? Because I think your research talks a lot about the complicity of European Union companies, institutions in the Israeli settlements, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, Europe, the European Union, and the various institutions have long been involved and directly and indirectly contributing to a lot of unlawful actions that Israel is carrying out in Palestine. And one of them that is very explicit is the settlement enterprise, Israel's settlement enterprise. And Europe and the European Union and member states, they have a very clear and consistent position on the illegality of the settlement enterprise and settlements across occupied Palestine. And of course, as we all know, the settlements, they amount to war crimes under international law. But at the same time, despite this very clear and explicit position that the Europeans have adopted on the settlement enterprise, we continue to see a lot of the agreements and cooperation agreements and research agreements that the European Union establishes or carries out with Israel. A lot of it ends up going also to settlements and academic institutions in settlements, or research institutions in settlements, but also to other activities that are contributing to other violations as part of the wider occupation. We also see a lot of European banks, pension funds, financial institutions, companies that are either physically contributing, or that are contributing directly again or indirectly to the maintenance, to the establishment, to the continuation of the settlement enterprise. Many of them through loans, through underwritings, through investments, and so on. And of course, there are many companies that are physically present as well in various settlements, whether in residential settlements or in agricultural settlements or industrial settlements across the West Bank and Jerusalem. So this is kind of how the private sector and some of the financial flows that go into the settlement enterprise are linked to Europe.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a bit earlier how voices that support Palestine are being suppressed. I think it's interesting you say this, because I think most of the people who are following the situation, they heard this speech of the mayor of Antwerp, Bart de Wever, who was telling, every Democrat should now, everybody with democratic values should now stand with Israel. It's the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. But then on the other side, I think recently, last week, we heard there was a resolution, I think, in the Flemish Parliament, supported by Jan Jan Bon, the minister-president of the Flemish region, to screen two organizations, De Wereld Morgen and Vrede VZW, which are two organizations that actually incorporate the Palestinian narrative and support Palestinian voices and call out the Israeli war crimes, that their subsidies should be screened and we should investigate whether or not they are supporting terrorists. There was also in France a temporary ban on protesting in favor of the rights of Palestinians. So, I mean, you can even see it in the West, how they are trying to suppress Palestinian voices. Is this something that you also noticed living here now in the West?
Yeah, definitely. And it's very dangerous, and it is not promising for what the future brings for this continent, Palestine or not in the picture. It looks like it is very easy to justify suppression of freedom of expression, of assembly, of association in a place where many of the people around the world thought represents, the prime of human rights, democratic values, and so on in Europe and in these countries. But the recent, but also other events as well, similar events have very well shown that human rights are not universal. Even in Europe, they do not apply to everyone and everything. And this is a very dangerous precedent to set. And I think the scenes from Berlin, from Germany, in how the protests for Palestine have been violently suppressed, how activists have been detained, beaten, and violently treated, how the Palestinian flag was banned from being, shown on the streets, and so on. I think these are all very worrying indicators to what is to come as well. And they are quite telling of how regimes and states here on this continent are following the lead of an apartheid entity, of a settler colonial entity, blindly, without thinking of what are the ramifications to their own values, to their own people, and how their own people would react to these. The other thing, by the way, that I've been noticing in speaking with a lot of Palestinian and Arab and other people standing in solidarity with Palestine from different nationalities, but particularly Palestinians here, is that there's also a common fear about being in this place, in this continent, at this very moment, especially with the very, very strong anti-Palestinian sentiment that the media has caught onto in the western part of the world. I think there's the media is also enabling the dehumanization and the demonization of Palestinians in large parts of the world. And this has not had positive effects in any way on Palestinians. And now people are feeling more and more at risk and unease and afraid of potential backlash, verbal violence, physical violence against them in their places of work, on the street, elsewhere in different parts of the society. And that should be, seriously addressed and considered.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the media. I think it's also really important to just stand back for a moment and look at the way how they are talking about the situation in Palestine. I think this is more of a rhetorical question. I can already guess your answer, but do you think it is portrayed in a nuanced way in the Western, in European American media?
Not at all. The Western media has always picked up the narrative and the rhetoric of the oppressor, unfortunately. And I think it has been a core problem in our struggle, because the media refuses to step out of the Zionist Israeli narrative for the large part, at least in the Western world. Of course, there are exceptions here and there, but generally the mainstream media continues to project Palestinians as Israel would like them to project Palestinians as terrorists, as barbaric, as all those images of Palestinians. And when the media wants to humanize Palestinians a little bit, they refer to Palestinians as in the sense of a humanitarian issue, and these poor Palestinians, like, now we're starting to hear a little bit, but they deserve a little bit of humanitarian assistance and support, because you can't just let them all die, so it's the media is also enabling and allowing the continuation of the massacres that we're seeing before us on TV and streamed live.
No, of course. I can imagine also it's very hard for you in a personal way to see what is happening in Palestine. I think a lot of people are feeling powerless, but what do you think we can do to change this situation? What would you say to people? Okay, how can I help? How can I resist and show my solidarity with the Palestinian cause?
Sure, we all feel a bit helpless, a bit hopeless as well about the current in the current moment, and we have, I think, every right to. It's very hard to be watching live on TV or on social media, live stream the total destruction of an entire population in a specific geographic area. That's not easy to witness on TV. It's also exhausting to continue to see scenes of death, scenes of destruction. It's I don't know how we're all reacting to this, like to seeing hospitals running out of electricity and completely in darkness, to seeing the scores of bodies on the screens, dead bodies, the screams, the appeals of Palestinians from Gaza for a ceasefire in every opportunity that they get on a screen that could potentially go out to the world. We've heard over the past 17 or 18 days appeals for the international community to send shrouds to Gaza because there's not enough of them, to at least be able to bury people in decent conditions. So it's a very, very inhumane situation, and it's a genocide what's going on. There's just one massacre after the another, and it's too much to comprehend for any human brain, for any human heart, for any human soul. So it's only natural that we sometimes feel helpless, that we're overwhelmed by the intensity and the gravity and the audacity of how things are being conducted, and the silence and the support of key actors of this international community. But at the same moment, we should not forget our power as a people, and our power in our collectivity, in our grouping, and our mobilizing. And today, we need to educate ourselves. We need to raise awareness about what's going on in Palestine and in the entirety of Palestine and what's happening to the Palestinian people. We can't talk about what's going on in Gaza or what's going on today as if it started on the 7th of October. And this is where we need to educate ourselves and continue to remind each other that this is, an ongoing colonial structural violence against Palestinians that is aiming for one purpose. And this should be the rhetoric, and this should be the narrative. And each of us has a responsibility to contribute to correcting the narrative, especially in the face of ongoing disinformation, propaganda, and other forms of suppressing Palestinian voices, Palestinian narrative, and so on. So educate, raise awareness, but also mobilize and move in action. We need to make some noise. People are being killed in scores, in the tens, in dozens, colleagues, friends, and others are losing their family members, their friends in the dozens over the past 2 weeks plus. And we're talking again about continuous massacres that are ongoing, continuous grave violations, crimes against humanity that are being committed in Gaza at the moment. So if we do not make some noise, like the noise that was made on Sunday, for example, in the massive demonstration in Brussels, but also all over Europe, then we will not be able to make a difference. So we need to continue making this noise, and we need to make it louder so politicians and decision makers listen, so that they respond to the appeal for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. A humanitarian pause will not do anybody any good. The situation on the ground is beyond dire, it's beyond catastrophic, and these are not only my words, this is the reality. So we need an end to the onslaught now.
Mm-hmm. Those are very strong words. Educate yourself, the people around you. We need to start moving. I think we definitely support it. Does it give you hope to see that, like last weekend, 40,000 people on the streets in Brussels, I think worldwide, millions of people in Barcelona, New York, Santiago, like all these big cities, they had massive protests. Does it give you hope?
It does. In a moment of darkness, deep darkness, it does give a glimmer of hope. Is it enough? I don't think so, unfortunately. And that's why I urge everybody to continue to make that noise and make it louder, because again, we're seeing mass support and masses standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against the atrocities and against the genocide and against impunity and against the ongoing colonization. But these protests have also been on the streets for decades, and hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of protests have been organized and taken on the streets over the past 70 plus years. But the reality continues to be one of oppression, one of persecution for the Palestinian people. So I don't know what we need to do in order to make the governments here listen and heed the calls of the people. But I think the best way to do it is to continue with the fight.
Continue with the fight. Okay, thank you very much, Maha, for this very engaging conversation. I wish you all the best, also to your Palestinian relatives. I hope they're doing well. I think the most important thing we will take from this conversation is your message that we should continue. We should continue moving, continue the struggle, continue to show our solidarity with the Palestinian people. I hope everybody who's listening also really like this is the big take that they take from this conversation. So thank you to all the listeners as well. Thank you again, Maha, and we will see and hear our listeners for our next podcast.
Thank you very much.